What is up guys, Fahan here and welcome back to another Ultimate review. This is the review of the BMW R1200C. Huge thanks to Unique Bike Rental for loaning me this bike for the review. Alright guys, so this is the ultimate review of the BMW R1200C. So this bike, you can rent it from Unique Bike Rentals, and they also have a whole range of other unique bikes from Ducatis to BMW Taurus, GS even. And yeah, so this is one of the bikes in the fleet, the R1200C. So this bike is BMW's attempt at a cruiser, and they actually built this bike to compete with Harley Davidson on the cruiser front. And this bike is made iconic through Tomorrow Never Dies. So James Bond, which is Pierce Brosnan and Michelle Yeoh, rode this bike through the streets of Saigon, trying to escape the bad guys. And all hell breaks out in Saigon. I'm gonna get on the bike, and with a ride height of 74 cm. Pretty much tiptoeing slightly on this bike, and as you can see, my arms are pretty stretched out because of the wide nature of this handlebar. But it's certainly something that I need to get used to. I'm not used to this kind of sitting position, and completely flat-footed on the ground right now. So it's a very comfortable bike for me lah. Okay, so I've researched on internet, and the fuel tank is 11.8 liters with a projected consumption of 5.1 liter per 100 km, which is pretty standard for a class 2. Okay, so starting it up uses a key. Okay, and you cannot help it but to feel that everything is analog on this, you know. Twist the ignition, press on the starter and the kill switch is this Harley style kind of starter. So starting it up. Ooh. Ooh, feels like a Harley, man. I mean, it's supposed to be a Harley competitor, so yeah, it is what it is lah. And you cannot help it but to observe that the handlebar is shaking like mad right now. It's literally shaking like mad. The vibration on this is really bad. It's certainly something that I wouldn't prefer to have, but some riders love the vibrations on their bikes lah. Well, I don't know. Right, so let's get this review started. Oops, I forget to put it off the side stand. Woo! Alright. Oh man, will my Insta 360 drop or not? Because of the vibrations. Okay, hopefully not lah. Okay lah. Oh, lucky. Still grace period. Leceh lah, I want to pay money. I spent a lot of money on this bike reviews, you know. Pump the fuel, season parking. So yeah. Alright, so buy our merch guys, buy our merch to support us. Alright, so the BMW R1200C. So riding this bike, the sitting ergonomics is very similar to Harley Davidson. I mean, it is a Harley Davidson competitor after all. Somewhat similar to the Fat Boy and the Sportster S, which I've tried out before. The sitting ergonomics is very similar. This kind of feeds forward sitting position with the arms stretched out, you know. But otherwise for me, I'm pretty much comfortable. The issue is that the vibrations lah. Not too keen on the vibrations, but I think some riders will love it lah. And changing gears on this, I stuck to neutral many times. The gear is kind of clunky lah. But other than that, I think it's really okay. The clutch is very easy to handle. The handling is pretty awesome also. Turns and leans wherever you point the bike to. So it's a very easily handling bike. But I would say that the handling is somewhat for intermediate riders lah. riders who have ridden like big bikes or bikes that are difficult to handle will be able to tame this bike lah. But if you're like me, you're not used to something like this, it takes a bit of getting used to lah, which I did. You know, I've been riding the bike out the whole day to get used to it, and yeah, pretty much gotten used to it, and it's very much similar to a Harley Davidson lah. Okay, so let's make a left right here. And on city streets, this bike honestly doesn't do too well. It's very cumbersome, but it's not as bad as a Harley. It's still manageable. This bike really prefers if you're in motion all the time lah, rather than stop traffic. It's gonna feel you know. But the acceleration on this is pretty sluggish, but it does get up to speed pretty okay. And if you're kind of guy who's looking for speed, this bike is not the bike for you lah, because it's much more of a cruising kind of bike with a cruising speed and acceleration, so it's not really that fast lah. But it's really awesome as a cruiser. I mean, it maintains speed very well, gets up to speed pretty okay. Like in the highway, I want to get up to 90 in a heartbeat. This bike is able to do it lah, the BMW 1200C. So signal indicators are very similar to a Harley. The controls on the handlebar controls right here, they're separated left and right. But unlike a Harley, you press again to cut off the indicators, right? There's actually an indicator cut off over here on the right handlebar control, so that's interesting. And riding this bike for a while now, gonna help it to say, but it does get kind of hot, but still bearable, not as hot as a Harley Davidson. So a Harley Davidson is hot till you're burning up, right? But this is still okay lah. It's still manageable lah. And I just love the sound on this one. There's this deep idling growl, you know, about this bike that I love. Oh, I keep revving this bike whenever I'm in a stoplight, you know. I just love the sound on this, you know. And the gauge cluster, yeah, is this analog style with like morning lights, you know. There's no tachometer, no fuel indicator other than the low fuel blinking light. Other than that, that's it. And I noticed there's two ABS lights on this, which is a pretty weird design choice. Maybe they just want to brag that hey, this BMW R1200C has ABS. Let's brag about it, you know. I mean, who brags about ABS? But I think back in the day, in the late 90s, in the early 2000s, ABS is uncommon on motorbikes, and they want to show off this feature. But nowadays it's so commonly available, but bikes like the CB150X don't have it, so and there's a CB150X there. A lot of riders unhappy with my review on that, but hey, I'm just speaking from the heart, man. So city streets, meh. But let's get into the highway, you know, where the R1200C really belongs.
Manufactured from 1997 to 2004, the BMW R1200C is an American-style cruiser made to compete with Harley-Davidson with German engineering. Known for its weird outlook and telelever front-end shocks, the R1200C was made iconic in the movie when James Bond rode an R1200C through the streets of Saigon in Tomorrow Never Dies. The BMW R1200C had several variations, including a full-dress touring model with street glide-inspired aesthetics, the R1200CL. Engine is a 1170cc air-cooled 4-stroke 4-valve twin-cylinder boxer with fuel injection and a 5-speed manual transmission. So as always, we're gonna start off with the riding position. So sitting on the R1200C, okay, this is typical cruiser position. Okay, arms stretched out, feet forward position, this typical Harley cruiser position. And my personal opinion, it's pretty comfortable and it doesn't hurt my back at all. Very ergonomical, and I think I'm able to go the long distances with this kind of position on the R1200C. It's a real mouthful. And the ride height is 74 cm, I'm 165, and pretty much as you can see, I'm almost flat-footed on the ground. So despite the weight of 265 kg, I think vertically challenged riders will be able to take on this bike in start-stop situation or at a stoplight lah. So no need to tiptoe on this bike, you really need to worry about it.
So before we talk about the design of the R1200C, take note that this bike is made famous from a James Bond movie, okay, Tomorrow Never Dies, ridden by James Bond himself, Pierce Bronson, though I grew up with the Daniel Craig era, with Michelle Yeoh hugging and accompanying him on that journey through the streets of Saigon while being chased by assailants. And because of that, this bike is sought after by collectors and motorcycle enthusiasts all over the world. And the values are really holding up for this bike overseas. But ignoring that fact, appearance-wise, it's supposed to look like an American style cruiser lah. But in my personal opinion, it looks pretty weird and it doesn't look like a cruiser at all. It looks more like a bobber, a heavily modified bobber. Maybe this is what BMW thinks a cruiser is supposed to look like, with a beefy body, especially the tank area, and the rear pillion seat can be folded up to be a backrest. 3 different adjustments can be adjusted while riding. And as I've said earlier in the review, this bike has a lot of variations. So this particular variation is the Adva Grande model, and noticeably it features less chrome than the other models. Basically, it's more blacked out, especially at the engine area, but there's still noticeably some chrome on it lah. And my take is that it makes it more easier to maintain. And also, just to highlight the uniqueness about the R1200C, okay, this telelever front fork suspension, which complements the front forks, and also the boxer engine with the cylinder heads popping out like this. Really gives it a unique look, which I'm not too keen. And also linking the cylinder head is the dual-sided exhaust. This bike is quite old, so the chrome definitely peeled off. And also this bike is fitted with brackets to put saddlebags on it, so you can quickly fit the side panniers to go for touring lah. So let's talk about the handlebar controls. So pretty straightforward, pretty simple, nothing too complicated, no riding modes, no riding tag to toggle. Somewhat similar to a Harley Davidson, especially with the signal controls. And unlike a Harley Davidson, which you press the indicator control one more time to cancel off the signal, on the BMW R1200C, you need to use this switch right here to cancel off the signal lah. And it works for both sides, by the way. And on the left over here, we have the high beam, low beam, passing light, the hazard light, and the horn. And to the left over here, there's the starter button and the kill switch lah, in this typical Harley style kind of switch lah. And the gauge cluster is pretty much analog, pretty much a late 90s bike. LCD is somewhat uncommon at that time, and then as you can see, there's a lot of things that is missing, unlike most bikes of this era, like fuel gauge, tachometer. All you're getting is a speedometer, the odometer, the trip meter, low fuel light, low oil light, and an array of warning lights to the right lah. And interesting to note, there's ABS on this. So on the gauge cluster, the warning lights, there's actually 2 ABS lights, so it keeps blinking for some reason. I'm not sure why. I suspect there's 2 separate warning lights for both front and rear ABS lah. I don't know why it keeps blinking though. It keeps alternating like a railroad crossing warning light or something. Other than that, it's pretty much basic and old school. So we got to talk about the riding tech that's on the BMW R1200C. ABS is optional for the Adva Grande model, but this bike has it. For the later variations, close to its end of production, ABS is standard on the R1200C. Single-sided swing arm shaft drive, and the most unique feature for this bike, in which this is the first time I'm seeing it on a motorcycle, telelever front end shock. So that is the name for this mechanism right here. Really reminiscent of the Italjet Dragster 200. And yeah, in my personal opinion, the suspension is really good. Really gives a nice, comfortable ride, and it's not that bouncy, and it absorbs all of the bumps and the road infections. Other than that, it's mostly mechanically Spartan in nature. Okay, so no riding modes, no traction control, no nothing. I mean, it's a late 90s era bike. What you expect? So horn check for the R1200C. Actually, the horn on this bike isn't working. I have been informed by Unique Bike Rentals, so they're shipping in the parts right now. And yeah, that's all I can say lah. And finally, we talk about price. Bike is out of production for quite some time already. 2004. You do your maths lah. This is a very rare bike, so there's not too much listings online. SG Bike Bud, there's 0 listings. And even on Carousel also, I had to do a Google search and I cannot find any listings on the app itself. There's this one old listing that was sold for $9,000, and we have one active listing, COE till 2028, $18,000 lah. But overseas, this bike is really sought after, and you can go up to 5 figures selling price lah for this bike. So I would reckon that Unique Bike Rental is going to export this bike once the COE is finished, because this particular model is under the NEA rebate lah. So there's no way for you to save this bike unless you convert it to classic scheme, which is pretty sad. And doing my research on the R1200C, surprisingly this bike sold pretty well. They made 40,000 of this R1200C during its production run. But the US consumers weren't really having it with this bike lah. In fact, they laughed at it because it's so weird looking. It doesn't really resemble much of a cruiser in my personal opinion. To me, it looks much more of a bobber as opposed to a cruiser with its big, huge tank and its very small rear end. People in the US really look down on this bike, and they go so far as to say that this bike is ugly, which I'm somewhat agree with them, because it's really weird looking. It's like nothing you've ever seen on the road before. To call this a cruiser is really an understatement, you know, because it doesn't really resemble much of a cruiser. But it does handle just right, and it does feel like a cruiser. But the design really doesn't match it lah. And several riders I comment that this bike feels much more like a modified Harley, in which you didn't have to do anything right out of the factory. So it feels more refined than a Harley in terms of the handling and the acceleration. So once again, this bike is brought to you by Unique Bike Rental. You can rent this bike from them, and they have a lot of other unique bikes, from BMWs to Ducatis to Triumphs. Just have a look at their social media pages, and if you're in for those Continental bikes, you can go to them for rental lah. And once again, I'm not too fond of the design on this bike, but the handling and the performance is pretty okay in my personal opinion lah, for a cruiser lah. And on the highway, no, it doesn't have a windshield, so the wind, you can really feel the full force of the wind. But I think you're cruising at this speed, like 90 to 100, it's really okay lah, not really complaining lah. Maintains speed very well. And I find that changing gears on this bike is slightly more refined than the Harley Davidson, but I still get to neutral for some reason, especially when you want to change from gear 1 to gear 2. And it's a 5-speed manual transmission. There's no 6 gear on it, and I frequently feel like as if there's not enough gears on it lah. But nowadays Harley Davidsons are more refined. They've packed a lot of riding technology on it. And in those days when BMW released the R1200C, Harley Davidson bikes are not that refined. So the R1200C is another offering that cruiser riders can go to if they want a more refined bike, unlike the Harley Davidson bike in those days. But Harley Davidson nowadays, you know, for their like current lineup, they've really packed a lot of riding technologies, and they refined the way the bike handles and performs. Currently, right now, this BMW is somewhat outdated to what Harley Davidson is currently offering lah. Especially with the riding tech on it. And BMW made a lot of accessories for the R1200C. They've marketed this bike to be very customizable, and riders really modify this bike. And additionally, there's a lot of versions. This is the Advanced Grande version, in which there's slightly less chrome on it and more graphite, especially on the engine areas. And other models, they've put more chrome on it. Some bike reviewers have commented that this is probably the most chrome they've ever seen on a BMW motorcycle. And I have to mention, there's dual exhaust on it, and this bike actually has side panniers, but Unique Bike Rental did not put the side panniers on this, but there's the bracket for you to put the side panniers on it lah. Okay, brakes are pretty good. I think stopping power should be okay lah. I mean, it's a cruising bike, we're not really going that fast, so I think ABS on it is really not necessary, but it's good to have. It's really good to have, because in the event of an emergency, you suddenly press on your brakes, you know, you're gonna lock up your wheels if there's no ABS on it lah. And I cannot help it, but the boxer engine on this sticks out like a sore thumb on it. Really provides a unique look to it lah, which I'm not too fond lah. Putting it nicely. Ooh. Whew, but the sound though, the sound of the BMW R1200C is really awesome. And speaking of the Boxer engine, this Boxer engine is not related to the Boxer engines on the GS or even the R90. This engine is made for this bike, and in fact the motor on this precedes the GS specifically for this model, so you're not getting the same kind of performance and sound with any other BMW motorcycle. Oh, okay. cannot Whew, rode this bike for about a whole day now, and I must say that if you're going long distance with it, it's gonna be an awesome bike. But for city riding, it doesn't do too well. Start-stop traffic can get pretty cumbersome to handle. And in Singapore, I noticed that there's not much of it on the roads. And in fact, Unique Bike Rental told me that they're not really sure that there's 5 of these R1200Cs in Singapore. So wow, which is pretty amazing. I'm getting the honor of riding a bike that is only available in the handful in Singapore, you know? Such an awesome honor lah. And you cannot help it but to notice that everybody is looking at you when you're riding this bike, you know. It's like they look at it and they're wondering, what the heck is this, you know? Is this a Harley? Is this a cruiser? But it bears the badge of a BMW. BMW really wanted to compete with Harley Davidson on it, only to be laughed at by the Americans. And yeah, for me, I'm not too keen on the design lah, as I've said. But I reckon that if you want a cruiser which is more refined and much more comfortable and not that cumbersome to ride on, the R1200C is the one lah. In my personal opinion nowadays, riding the modern Harleys, the Fat Boy, the Sportster, the Pan Am, the R1200C comes close to the current era of Harley Davidson bikes lah. Okay. I just love the sound, man. The deep idling and growl on this is really awesome, sir. And I love the suspension on this. You don't really feel the minor bumps, road markings and road imperfections on the road. And even on the humps also, the forks really take in the impact really well. I think this has to do with the telescopic, I don't know what is it, there's a special name for it. The front fork assembly is pretty unique with the rear shock style kind of suspension, and really has a nice look to it lah. I'm not sure if any other bike has this kind of suspension setup, but with the BMW R1200C has a unique look thanks to this suspension that it has lah. Alright guys, so I'm gonna give you guys my final thoughts and conclusions about the R1200C, and yeah, we'll see you in a bit. Right guys, so I've had 2 days with the R1200C, and I must say that when you're riding it, it's slightly more refined than a Harley. It's a very comfortable ride. The handling is pretty awesome on it. Cannot go wrong with the handling, and the sound, I really love the sound on this. There's this nice deep idle and growl that you come to expect with a cruiser. And also the vibration, I mean, although I'm not too keen on it, but it's what you expect in a cruiser. So the vibration is really on point with the cruiser lah, with the shaking handlebars and everything. It's very much an old school kind of vibe to the bike that is very reminiscent of a classic bike, but in a modern era form. I mean, this bike is also quite old lah. I mean, 1997 to 2004 production. And whenever you're riding out with this bike, I cannot help it but to notice everybody's looking at you, riders, pedestrians, drivers in their cars will just look at this bike and admire it. You know, it's really a head turner. Maybe, I don't know, they're trying to figure out is this a Harley or but why it bears a badge of BMW, you know. And interesting to note that BMW made this bike to compete with Harley Davidson, but it somewhat failed because it wasn't really that successful. I mean, 40,000 units in the span of 6 years, and now they have the R90. So that is basically the spiritual successor for this bike lah, in which BMW has put more riding tech and brought the bike into the modern era. But the R1200C really screams 90s, late 90s, with the aesthetics and the riding tech and everything. The performance wise, kind of sluggish. I mean, it's a cruiser, you cannot expect speed out of it. Fuel consumption also, I think pretty good in my personal opinion. I'm surprised actually at the fuel consumption. It's pretty good actually. After riding it the whole day, as I typically do, I still did not get any low fuel warning whatsoever. I reckon that it's going to do well in a long tour, going up to Thailand or Malaysia. But you have to remember that this bike is really old, so spare parts may be an issue, and dealership support, we're not sure whether PML still supports these bikes. Although Unique Bike Rental told me that they are getting the horn replaced with parts shipped from overseas. So that's going to take a while. But other than that, I think it's a good bike, but it's an old bike. You gotta take a risk lah when wanting to own an old bike lah, given the lack of support from BMW. Probably. I'm not sure. Maybe BMW riders can enlighten me whether they will still be able to bring in parts for an old bike like this, you know. Other than that, I'm not too keen on the design, especially. They mentioned that this is supposed to compete with Harley Davidson, but it doesn't look like a cruiser at all. It reminds me of a bobber. Other than being an icon of James Bond, I think it's a fairly decent bike lah. A very decent old school class 2 cruiser. Once again, this bike is actually loaned out to me by a Unique Bike Rental, so you can borrow this bike from them, test it out yourself. And they also have a whole range of other unique bikes, continental bikes specifically, from Triumphs to Ducatis to BMWs, even an Adiva and also a Gilera Foucault lah. That's it for the vlog, and we'll see you in the next one.
Give me all of your lies, 'cause you're my demon in disguise. I learned to